Hi everyone, my name is April and this is Thrifted Transformations, the show where I go thrifting for old clothing and transform them into something new. In this episode, I was inspired by Taylor Swift's color-blocked dress at the Grammys and wanted to recreate it. The hardest part was finding items at the thrift store that were the same exact colors as her gown, but I did my best with this pink prom dress and the orange skirt, and that totaled up to be $20. I hope you guys enjoy this transformation, and let's get started. I love thrifting dresses and transforming them because they already provide you with all the materials you need, like boning, zippers, and lining fabric. The first thing I'm going to do is deconstruct the dress. Originally, I wanted to recreate the same skirt that Taylor Swift wore, but the prom dress didn't provide me with enough fabric to give it the fullness I wanted, so now I'm changing my plan and going with a short full skirt instead. To make the gathered flared skirt, I start from the bottom of the skirt so I can save the hemline and measure up however long I want the skirt to be. Next, I cut along the markings I made and sew 2 rows of basting stitch along the top of the skirt so I can gather it. The first row is sewn at 1/4 of an inch and the second row is sewn at 3/4 of an inch. Since my seam allowance is 1/2 an inch, it will be right in the middle of these 2 lines. Once the 2 rows of basting are sewn, pull on the bobbin threads gently and gather the skirt to fit your waist. To make the waistband, I cut out 2 strips of fabric that are 2.5 inches wide by whatever size my waist is, and then I apply some interface on one of the strips. The waistband without interfacing is going to be the lining. Next, face the 2 waistbands right sides together and sew along the top. Then lay the waistband flat and understitch the lining down. I folded over the seam allowance of the waistband 1/2 inch and pressed it with an iron before sewing it on the skirt. Pressing the seam allowance makes it super easy for me to see where to sew because as I sew, I simply just line up the pressed seam allowance in the middle of the 2 basting lines on the skirt and then sew on top of the crease line. Now I can sew in the zipper, but first I shorten it to about 7 inches. To insert a zipper, you want to first line it up along the seam and mark where the zipper stop is. Then sew from the bottom of the skirt up to that marking. I'm using the method where you base stitch the rest of the seam closed and then sew the zipper from underneath. And I don't know why I decided to use this method because it's my least favorite way because I can never get the top of the waistband to line up in the end. So use whatever method that works best for you. Lastly, fold the lining waistband underneath so that it sandwiches the zipper tape and all the raw edges of the waistband, and use the stitch in a ditch method to sew everything together. I basically just folded the lining underneath and sewed from the top side of the skirt right into the same seam. Since I already pressed the seam allowance of the waistband, it made it easy for me to just sew through all the layers. And that's pretty much it for the skirt. Since I used the original hemline, I don't have to hem the skirt. Moving on to the crop top, I first removed the lining from the skirt and then cut down the side seam. Since the top that Taylor Swift wears doesn't require a lot of material, I'm going to cut the skirt in half and use half of it to drape the bodice on my dress form. Before draping the bodice, it's helpful to put some style tape on your dress form so you can see where to drape. I first drape the center front and then make my way towards the back. When draping, you only need to drape one side of the dress form to keep everything symmetrical. After draping all 4 pieces, I add my seam allowances and then sew those pieces together to make sure everything looks like how I imagined it. As you can see, it fits on my dress form, but I had to fit it on myself afterwards because I'm not the same size as her. Once everything is fitted, I lay it back down and blend out any lines and make any adjustments. Then I trim away the seam allowance and transfer the pieces onto paper. After finalizing my pattern pieces, I can cut out the actual pieces out of the lining and bodice fabric and sew everything together. Next, I'm going to reuse the boning from the pink dress and sew them right next to the seam lines of the bodice. You can sew them into the lining bodice or the actual bodice. I just sewed it into the actual bodice. By sewing the boning on the seam allowance next to the seam line, the sewing doesn't show through the front of the bodice, only on the seam allowance. I am falling for you now, but you don't see. I made sure to leave a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top and bottom of the bodice so I can trim away the boning afterwards since I didn't trim it away ahead of time. I'm screaming, screaming, oh, it's always the same, and you don't see me, do ya? Next, I added some interfacing along the top and sides of the bodice and placed it right sides together with the lining, and then sew the 2 bodices together along the top. Afterwards, understitch the lining so that it stays down and doesn't slide up, and then sew along the bottom. I turned everything right sides out through the open sides, and lastly, to finish off the back, I tuck in the raw edges and simply sewed it closed. As for the closure, I just sewed in 4 hook and eyes, and I'm so sorry that I did not get any good clips of this part. I was just so focused on finishing that I didn't film the last part. Here is the final transformation. But you don't see me. I'm just someone in the crowd. I hope you enjoyed this episode, even though I didn't end up recreating her actual skirt, but at least this gathered skirt will be more wearable. And to be honest, you guys, this bodice does not stay up on me at all. Every time I exhale, everything falls down. I don't know how Taylor Swift wore it, but I highly recommend finding those rubber strips, if they sell those, the ones that are on the inside of strapless bras and dresses to help hold it up. I also wish I made the waist of the skirt a little bit tighter on me so that it sits higher on my waist. Anyways, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more thrifted transformations and other awesome DIYs. See you next time!